Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And today, I want to talk about history. Specifically the history that we, as in those of us who are alive right now, have experienced. Because after the past year, I think it's safe to say we've experienced quite a bit. Some of it will find its way into history books, and those experiences will be recounted and studied for years to come, and that study will continue long after we're gone. Now, I find that somewhat surreal, and I suspect others share that feeling too, because I have older relatives who have lived through major historical events. My father told me what it was like to live through the Cuban Missile Crisis and the JFK assassination. My grandmother told me what it was like to live through World War II and the Great Depression. My uncle told me what it was like to be in Vietnam. There's always some extra weight to history that you've actually experienced. You can read every textbook and first-hand account you can find, and you can watch all the documentaries that are out there on the subject. It'll never be the same as actually living through a major historical event. And that raises a relevant question to those of us who are alive right now. How will we tell future generations about the COVID-19 pandemic? Because I think even professional historians agree, this pandemic was a historic event of immense significance. I know it's a very sore subject for some. Many find it downright frustrating, if not agonizing, for all the hardship it's caused. But that's exactly why we should take a step back and see the bigger picture. And for once, we don't have much guidance from our older relatives. Both my parents and all my older relatives agree. They have never experienced something like this before. This pandemic was uncharted territory even for them. Whether you're just a kid or middle-aged right now, another generation will come, and that generation won't know what it's like to live through the COVID-19 pandemic. They may know it happened and that it was a big deal, but they won't be able to grasp the sheer breadth of its impact. That's where we come in. We'll be able to share our first-hand experiences of this historical event. But that raises a host of other questions. What details will we single out? What moments will we recall with heavy hearts? What lessons will we try to convey? For something that unfolded over the course of a year, these are not easy questions to answer. Not everyone experiences historical events the same way, and not everyone comes out of them the same either. There are those who will see the same events through a particular lens, and their narrative might be radically different from our own. It often depends on someone's location, background, politics, or socioeconomic status. I have friends from many different walks of life. Some are hardcore conservatives, others are card-carrying liberals. Some live in very rural parts of the country. Others have lived in cities all their lives. Their depictions of the darkest months of the pandemic are vastly different. That I can attest to. But despite those differences, there are a few common themes. And I think those aspects of history are worth sharing with future generations. Among those themes is the idea that everything around us, this vast, complex civilization we've built, it's a lot more fragile than we care to admit. It can be humming along one moment, seeming unstoppable and resilient. Then, in the span of just a few weeks, it could all come to a screeching halt, all because of a tiny little organism. Now, we all experience occasional disruptions, be it natural disasters, economic hardship, or political upheavals. But most natural disasters pass through quickly. Terrorist attacks happen in the span of a few seconds, and economic hardships are complex, evolving, and unequal in their impact. The same goes for political upheavals. They're these broad, intangible forces born largely from irrational people just being irrational in a more organized manner. But most of these things only have localized impacts. Most disasters can only do so much to affect the world at large. But a pandemic is different. A pandemic is uniquely potent in its ability to affect every person on every corner of the planet. Pandemics don't discriminate. They don't care about national borders, local politics, ethnic tensions, racial background, or how much money is in your bank account. All that matters is you're human and a potential host. And given our intensely tribal nature, a pandemic is basically the ultimate counter. For me and many others, this was one of the scariest parts of the COVID-19 pandemic. When it spread, it did not discriminate. It may have started in China, but once it got out, its origins didn't matter. It crossed cultures, borders, and backgrounds with ease. It didn't matter how proud you were of your heritage or your nation. It still made you sick. It infected Americans as easily as it infected Iranians. That universality was a big part of what made it so devastating. At the same time, it also brought out our collective weaknesses. We always knew they were there, but we didn't appreciate just how vulnerable they made us. Like I said, humans are very tribal. We don't see ourselves as one species. We see ourselves as a tribe or community. What happens on the other side of the planet doesn't concern us as much as what happens across the street. It's just how we're wired. But as a result, when a deadly disease like COVID-19 emerges on the other side of the planet, we don't prepare. We don't pay attention. And that has consequences. Deadly, tragic consequences. And that's another theme worth emphasizing. I know that when I tell my future children about this pandemic, I won't just call it a disaster. I'll call it a tragedy. Because this wasn't like an earthquake, hurricane, or blizzard. We can't do anything to stop those. But we can stop pandemics in their tracks. We're not living in the dark ages anymore. We have the medicine, tools, and knowledge to deal with it. Hindsight can be frustrating, but it's still painfully clear at times. We now know we had opportunities to stop the COVID-19 pandemic. We just didn't take advantage of them. Some of that was just a potent combination of bad luck, honest mistakes, and ignorance. But some of it was willful negligence and gross incompetence. At the end of the day, there were people in place to make the right decisions. They either didn't know any better, made a bad judgment call, or just flat out didn't care. And because of that, we all suffered. The choices and inactions of a few affected the many. Because of that, millions got infected who didn't have to, and thousands died and suffered when they didn't need to. And throughout the pandemic, there were many people on the front lines still fighting it. Heroic, nameless people in hospitals and labs, doing what they could to combat this deadly disease. And yet, there were still those who refused to trust the science. They refused to accept reality in favor of their own narrative. That had consequences too, the kind that only made things much worse for much longer. Now, if there's one hard lesson we should all take from this pandemic, it's that denigrating science and experts comes at a price. And sometimes that price is paid in human life, a price that can never be repaid. Those losses aren't just tragic in their own right. They leave deep personal scars. There were people who could not be with their loved ones when they drew their last breath. There were instances where people couldn't even have a proper funeral with their families. These are painful, heartbreaking stories that rarely make it into history books. But that's why they're worth telling to others. Not every story has to be that painful. Some experiences can be minor while still having a major impact. Because for many, the moment they realized the pandemic was serious came before the lockdowns even started. For me, it really started to hit when major sporting events like the NBA and the NCAA tournament were canceled. I'll never forget the time I saw an NBA game get canceled just minutes before tip-off. And I'll also never forget seeing baseball games with no fans in the stands, or movie theaters with no new movies to show. It may seem like a temporary inconvenience in the future, but at the time, it was just unthinkable. The idea that life as we knew it would be so upended just seemed unreal to us. And the fact it lasted for months on end, disrupting holidays, major events, and family gatherings, that just amplified the impact. And I felt that impact personally. Because during the pandemic, I had close family members experience major milestones. At one point, there was a wedding that I could not attend, one I badly wanted to be part of, but just couldn't because of the pandemic. I ended up having to attend it through a FaceTime call of all things, and not being there, it just broke my heart. And to date, it still does, knowing I missed something that special. I'm sure many have a similar story that's just as personal. There are kids who lost an entire year at school. There are teenagers who had their emerging lives put on hold. There were those who lost their jobs, couldn't find work, and endured immense hardship for months on end. Words cannot always do justice to those experiences, but for the sake of history and learning from it, we should make the effort. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Take care and stay safe, now and for whatever future history has in store for us.